Welcome to Newsmakers by NTD Television and the Epoch Times. I'm Paul Graney.
And I'm Tiffany Meyer.
It's been 2 long weeks since Election Day, and some places are still counting ballots. Can you believe that? We're talking about places like California, Colorado, and Arizona. It's a joke, really.
But the gloves are coming off in Arizona. The Republican candidate for Attorney General is now suing election officials for widespread errors that he says disenfranchised voters. Kari Lake did not put it so eloquently. She simply called it a botched election.
And we want some information. We're on a timeline, a very strict timeline when it comes to fighting this. And we want some information. We're on a
The count is set to be certified next Monday, but Lake is now warning officials she has at least one smoking gun to prove this wasn't a fair election. We don't know what that smoking gun is just yet, though.
And in a nostalgic nod to 2020, Donald Trump is also telling Arizona to redo the election. A new report by Republican attorneys who were watching on Election Day found that over 60% of the voting centers they visited experienced material problems. And here's Lake again.
They did it in broad daylight. It was blatant. There was no subtlety about what they did when they discriminated against people who chose to vote on Election Day. 63% of polling places were inoperational or only partially operational.
And Republicans are upset that in-person voting was affected because they tend to come out in force on Election Day. AG hopeful Abe Hamadeh is officially only 500 votes behind his Democratic opponent, and he says he has evidence of hundreds of voters who were unable to cast votes on that day because of problems.
Did nobody tell the election officials Election Day was coming up? It's like you had one job. Here's Maricopa County election official Bill Gates.
Again, we understand that there were problems that made an impact, that created inconvenience, and we're going to do better next time.
Let's hope so, Bill. Well, I should probably mention that Bill Gates has a fund that supports anti-Donald Trump Republicans. It's probably nothing really, Ryan.
So where do we go from here? Is Kari Lake's insistence that she will still be governor just a pipe dream? And will Abe Hamadeh's lawsuit go anywhere?
With us to discuss is Jenna Ellis, Epoch Times contributor and former senior advisor and counsel to President Trump. Jenna, great to see you again. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks. Great to see you.
So, Jenna, there were plenty of unsuccessful challenges in 2020. How strong is Hamadeh's case here?
Yeah, well, as we learned in 2020, the Democrats and the leftists and a lot of election officials simply just try to run out the clock. And I actually spoke with one of the attorneys on the ground on my podcast on Monday. And what he told me was that election officials, specifically in Maricopa County and other places in Arizona, are delaying even releasing any of the data. And so some of this crucial data about how the elections were conducted and exactly how many ballots were affected, clearly, as you and others have reported, it's around 17,000, but making sure that there is a precise enough data question so that there can be claims in court that are specific enough to be adjudicated still remains a problem. And so I think that looking at the difference between 2020 and then coming into now the 2022 election, we're seeing that in Arizona, not a lot has been done for election integrity. And so whether or not this was just sheer negligence or whether some of these election officials actually acted in bad faith, I think is a question that deserves to be answered. But really, with a lot of these lawsuits, like Abe Hamadeh's and like Kari Lake saying that she is going to have some of these smoking guns come out and whistleblowers are coming forward as well. What we really need to see in Arizona is judicial courage. And we need to make sure that judicial branches and judges that are looking at these lawsuits don't do what they did in 2020, which was simply look the other way and say, well, this is too political. We don't want to look like we are disenfranchising voters. So they actually effectively do disenfranchise voters by being unwilling to address election integrity questions on the merits.
Well, I think an interesting point here, we heard Kari Lake saying she's kind of in a race against time with this. They're going to certify the election on Monday. Can you talk a little bit to that, the timing involved here, and how it relates to how long has it actually taken them to count the votes?
Well, it's absolutely ridiculous that we don't have some of the answers to these questions, and that Arizona is poised to potentially certify on Monday. That's exactly what happened in 2020. And if you remember, the initial Trump legal team challenges were simply to delay the certifications until we could gather enough and sufficient data to have those challenges in court. The initial question was to delay the certifications until the evidence that was still being gathered could be brought in court. And of course, the judiciary and judges denied all of those requests, but hopefully some of those requests that are now being brought in Arizona, and some election officials who have the prerogative and the capacity and the power to not certify what they know will be results that are not accurate, won't go ahead and actually certify on Monday, but will wait and see the results of those challenges further in court. That's what needs to be done, and this should not be a partisan issue. Everyone, regardless of whether you're a Democrat, a Republican, Independent, anything else, if you are a citizen of the United States and you have a right to vote in this country, you should be concerned that every legal vote is counted fairly, and that there is no one that has been disenfranchised, like the 30% of polling locations just in Maricopa County, and like we've talked about, an estimate of about 17,000 ballots.
We see that Masters and Blake are even further behind than Hamada. You think there's any hope for them, or are we just really looking at the AG race here?
Well, I think it's interesting how much the margin of error here is so significant. I mean, if we're talking about 17,000 ballots, that certainly is outcome determinative in more races than just the AG and the governor. And so that's why a lot of people, including the attorney that I spoke with and other attorneys on the ground, are saying that the fairest, best solution is to simply redo the election. Now, whether or not the judiciary will actually allow for and provide that remedy remains to be seen. But of course, we hold special elections all the time, and that's something that could be done in this instance. But this is why state legislatures, especially Republican-led state legislatures who care at all about election integrity, need to provide for that type of remedy by statute. This is why myself and others who advocate for election integrity have been calling on state legislatures to make sure that legislation is in place so that we can get these judicial remedies, like a new election or like something else, to make sure that we see that there is fairness in elections for every race that might be affected, including Blake Masters or anyone else down ticket.
Incredible.
And Jenna, speaking of the something else part, Kari Lake did mention having a smoking gun. So what would that need to be from a legal perspective?
Well, I think it really depends on the judge, right? And that's what we've seen, and that's what's so unfortunate. I think if she has a smoking gun that can show that there specifically were people who were disenfranchised, and that the amount of ballots is enough to change the outcome of the election, that should, in my opinion, be enough to at least have a hearing on the merits. What happened in 2020 was that all of President Trump's lawsuits were kicked out based on standing. We never got an opportunity to present the evidence that we had. And so hopefully for Kari Lake and also for Abe Hamada, they actually get their day in court, regardless of whether or not anyone thinks in the media that there's enough evidence to move forward. From a judicial standard, if she has a claim that shows that it would be outcome determinative, in my mind, that is absolutely enough to get to a hearing on the merits.
Got about 30 seconds, Jenna. So considering it's Thanksgiving and all that, we have the certification deadline coming up. What are you watching most closely for next steps?
I think it all depends on how the judge in this case responds, and also whether or not there will be courage among election officials to wait for a judicial opinion, or whether they will go ahead and certify like they did in 2020, even when there are valid legal challenges still pending.
Jenna Ellis, Epoch Times contributor. Thank you, Jenna. Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving. Thank you.
And coming up after the break, former President Trump or future President Trump. He also recently announced his bid for the 2024 presidential race, but now there's a new special counsel to investigate him. AG Merrick Garland just appointed Jack Smith. We have the details after the break. We also have Liz Harrington, spokesperson for former President Trump. She joins us next to discuss Mr. Smith's appointment as special counsel. Coming up after a break. Come back.
Everything that's reported on television isn't always true, but it should be. NTD, the power of truth. Now available 24/7 on television and streaming platforms.
NTD's Capitol Report. It's about getting answers, cutting through the fog of politics. It's about your questions and our chances to ask.
What is the net impact of the American Congressman Graves? Thank you for joining us.
We're speaking to those in power to find out what does this mean for the people. We're here so you are in the know.
Navigating a world of economic madness, you need to have the right guide. What do today's decisions mean for your tomorrow? We ask why. What's the alternative? Uncover the deeper reasons and the hidden influences, and highlight the real opportunities for profit.
At NTD Business, we connect the dots for you. Good evening. Thanks for joining us. NTD Business. I'm Paul Green.
At The Nation Speaks, we don't just scratch the surface. We want to go wide and deep. Our viewers come away with a much richer understanding of the issues of the day. We really make a big effort to bring on different voices onto the show. We don't just talk to experts and newsmakers, which of course are extremely important, but we also want to hear from the American people. So the people who are impacted by the policies and issues that we're talking about, because what they have to say is just as important to the national conversation.
Welcome back. About a week ago, I'm sure you'll remember, Donald Trump announced his run for president in 2024.
And just 3 days later, AG Merrick Garland appointed a special counsel to investigate him. Jack Smith, who's a former career Justice Department prosecutor. Probably not music to Trump's ears. Smith will now oversee not one, but 2 investigations into Trump. Garland even cited Trump's candidacy announcement as the reason for his announcement.
Unreal. Smith will investigate whether anyone illegally interfered with the transfer of power after the 2020 election or the certification of electoral college votes on January 6th.
And not only that, he'll also oversee the investigation involving classified documents at Mar-a-Lago.
It's also worth noting, if you haven't heard, Smith's wife is the filmmaker behind a recent documentary about Michelle Obama. He's also helped indict Republican Governor Bob McDonnell, only to see that conviction overturned unanimously by the Supreme Court. The Article 3 project's Mike Davis called Smith a, quote, Democrat heat-seeking missile to take out Republican presidential candidates. Liz Harrington, spokesperson for former President Donald Trump, joins us now to discuss Mr. Smith's appointment as special counsel. Liz, it's great to see you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Good to be with you.
Liz, so what is the president planning in response to this?
Well, he's made it very clear that he is not going to cooperate with this sham investigation. Look, this has been an ongoing witch hunt for 7 years now, and it has to end. And it's so obvious, as you just stated, that this announcement comes after only 3 days after President Trump made his announcement for the White House in 2024. It's clearly political, and this so-called special prosecutor has so many conflicts of interest, not least of which his wife, who was a huge booster for the Obamas, and he himself was handpicked by Barack Obama and Eric Holder to lead a division of the Justice Department under Barack Obama's presidency, and also went after conservatives with the IRS scandal. It's completely uncalled for. This is banana republic territory, and there's no way that we can cooperate with this. And other Republicans, especially when they take back the House majority, need to defund this sham investigation.
And Liz, so what is Trump's legal team looking like to respond to this?
Well, we're going to fight it in every avenue we can. I mean, this is clearly political. This is banana republic territory, and we have to really get tough. And President Trump is going to fight back, as he always does. But I think it's also been really imperative on these Republicans in Congress to take the funding away, because this is illegitimate. Look, if you're talking about investigating a disruption to the peaceful transfer of power, Jack Smith should look no further than his former boss, Barack Obama. What they did to sabotage the transfer of power in 2016 to 2017. That was what was so criminal with the spying on President Trump's first campaign. And we know that this illegitimate investigation is only going to be designed for the same thing, a leak factory, to try to muddy up our campaign and try to damage President Trump with no facts, but just to hurt his campaign in the eyes of the public. The good thing is the public is not buying this anymore. They've lost all credibility. So legally, we're going to take every action that we can, and we're not going to abide by this, because the people see through it and they want equal justice under the law.
I think from a PR perspective, the timing is quite questionable, but I think also from a financial perspective, because we see some big Republican donors have said they're not going to donate to Trump this time around for whatever reason. So will an investigation or investigations like this be expensive to the point that it could hurt his campaign finances?
Well, look, we have had to deal with this from the moment Donald J. Trump went down the escalator. It's absolutely appalling. And they've come from every single angle. President Trump's always been innocent, but you see it, in the pages of the fake New York Times. You see it all across. These new sham investigations are being resurfaced again and again that he's already fought a million times before. So of course it's draining, and it's designed to, have a death by 1,000 cuts, to really dirty up our campaign. But it's not going to work, because President Trump represents the American people. And he talked about this in his announcement last week. He's the one person who is able to take on this corruption in the swamp. He's done it once before, and he certainly will do it again. That's why they're coming after him illegitimately in all these different jurisdictions, trying to hit him financially, trying to hurt him with public opinion. But again, it's not going to work, because he's a man of the people and he's going to fight for them.
So you mentioned the House already. I want to ask you, what is he encouraging maybe Kevin McCarthy or the other potential speakers of the House to do? And also, what can he do if he does become president again about this apparent politicization of the DOJ?
We need a complete cleaning of house, and this is so out of control. I think it is. I think he is the person to do it, because he's been there before and he knows how deep the swamp is. And I don't think anyone really quite knew until President Trump was in there during his first term. So we're going to have to completely clean the house. We're also going to have these Republicans, once they take over, to do real investigations. I mean, you're talking about this sham special counsel when there's not a single special counsel for Hunter Biden, when we know there are so many crimes on that laptop implicating not just him, but of course his father as well, with shady dealings with the Chinese Communist Party, with Ukraine, and the list of countries goes on and on. That's despicable. So we need real investigations into wrongdoing, not just going after political opponents. We need to stop with the show trials and the show me the man, I'll show you the crime. That's what you're getting against President Trump. Republicans need to actually investigate real crimes and see where the facts lead.
It's just been incredible. Liz Harrington, we appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It certainly doesn't seem like the DOJ is impartial or engaging in blind justice when it comes to Trump, so it seems. Be interested to see how the investigations play out over the coming weeks and months, especially if Trump does become the GOP nominee for 2024.
Indeed, it will be interesting to watch, so we'll be keeping a close eye on the developments. And coming up after the break, we're joined by Darlene Sanchez, who's here to discuss the disturbing world of furries, and a warning by a convicted pedophile. That and more after the break.
evening. Thanks for joining us.
There's reporting that can be trusted. There are programs that can inspire every generation. There is a television network worth watching and sharing. Our commitment is to bring you the facts and to show you the world. We won't be divided by politics, and we won't be swayed by the dollar. We believe in the strength of our nation and the hope in our shared humanity. We are NTD Television, and we are proud to bring you news you can trust and programs that make you smile. NTD Television, now available 24/7 on television and streaming platforms.
We are being censored. America's news outlets no longer provide the truth. 90% of news outlets in the United States are controlled by 6 corporations. They're not out to tell you the truth of what's happening. They're out to tell you the picture of the world that they represent. The Epoch Times is independent. We're not controlled by any special interest, and we never will be. This is a battle between truth and deceit, a battle between forces that would ensnare this country in ignorance, and between a media that wants to present you with the truth. Subscribe today to our digital edition at theepochtimes.com and join the Americans who are seeking truth and tradition. Read the difference on all your devices. We'd love to have you on board.
Welcome back. This next story may prompt you to consider homeschooling. There's a new trend popular in schools involving students dressing up as half human, half animal. And no, I'm not just talking about Halloween. Apparently, these students identify as their chosen animal and dress, even act accordingly.
I'd like to think you're joking, but I know you're not.
I'm not. While it may seem strange, or maybe just like kids playing dress-up, a convicted pedophile is warning parents that the furry craze in schools opens the door to sexual predators.
And it's called furry fandom, and it has been popular among adults engaging in certain activities for years. And while, of course, not every furry is a pedophile, pedophiles are increasingly using the furry craze to groom children.
Just incredible. Joining us to discuss this incredibly disturbing topic is Epoch Times reporter Darlene Sanchez. Darlene, great to see you.
Hi. How are you?
Great, thanks.
Nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Of course. So, what does it mean to be a furry or an animal avenger, as some students are labeling themselves?
Yes, well, furry, basically, if you're referring to the ones in schools, which is basically how this starts out, they are students that dress up as an animal persona. They usually have headbands with ears. They have tails and sometimes furry gloves. And they will often hiss and paw at other students.
Why are they doing this?
They are doing it apparently for attention, and because there is also some what they call pet avengers. It's kind of like a Marvel comic thing that's out there, and I believe, from my understanding, it has something to do with that. You know, they see it as, you know, Avenger or something fun.
And in your reporting, you mentioned that pedophiles are using this furry craze to groom children. So how exactly is this playing out?
Okay, so when I spoke with a therapist, John Euler, who has been working with these pedophiles for years, basically, you know, he said he learned about it about 10 years ago. And it is the perfect disguise for a pedophile, because you have, you know, they're dressing up as well, and sometimes in full furry costumes like mascots. and they go to furry conventions. And this starts online with students that might be more interested in learning more, and they get more and more involved in it until eventually, they make contact with them, perhaps in person at one of these conventions.
Have there been any tragedies, for want of a better word?
Well, I mean, I do know, I did speak with another, he's a neuropsychologist in Texas. He talked about the same thing. He said, it's something to be wary of. Parents really need to, keep an eye on this, as anything online, but, this looks harmless. It looks fun, they're dressing up. So there was a convention, I think, in the Seattle area, and there were several arrests made at that furry convention, including some for sexual assault.
And so, Darlene, with all the people you've spoken to, what advice do they have for parents to make sure their kids are safe?
Yeah. Well, I think the best thing that you can do as a parent is to pay attention to your intuition. I mean, we as parents, we all feel sometimes, there's something not right here. There's something strange about this. And, the professionals I spoke with said you really need to pay attention to that. If it feels wrong, if it looks strange, then you probably have a good reason to think that, especially when you have males or adults dressed up or in contact with children in a context that could be sexualized, whether it be drag queens or, in schools at drag queen story time, which is something popular in schools right now, or whether it's something like, a furry convention where you have grown men dressed up in full furry suits that are totally disguised. So it's a great way for them to get close to children.
How about in the schools, Darlene? Of course, now kids are encouraged in certain schools to identify as this or that or whatever they want. Are the schools encouraging this type of identifying as a dog or a cat or whatever?
I don't think they're encouraging it, but I don't think that they are, some at least, I don't think are really putting their foot down and saying, look, this is a distraction, regardless of what, the student wants to dress up as. If you're dressing up in school, that's a distraction to other students. I mean, some of these students are even, not using utensils during lunch and eating their lunch, like an animal would eat, from a bowl.
And Darlene, you mentioned earlier how many of the children are choosing this for attention. So maybe what are some other ways they can get attention without potentially being, a sexual victim?
Well, I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong per se. And, it's just like one of the other therapists said, people dress up. There's nothing wrong with that. But when you're doing it all the time and, if it's for an attention thing, there's other ways. I mean, think about ways to get positive attention. Students who, do their work, who actually, participate in class, you get a lot of attention if you do something like that. Teachers pay attention to you. Get involved in your community, get involved in your school. Do positive things and you will get a lot of attention. That's what I would say to kids.
Just incredible. Darlene, we appreciate it. Thank you for your good work. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
And speaking of grooming, coming up after the break, Dr. James Lindsay, who was suspended on Twitter for calling someone a groomer one too many times, is joining us. We'll be discussing James' recent reinstatement to Twitter, Elon Musk, and the battle against Marxism and the sexualization of children. All of that coming up after the break.
NTD's Capital Report. It's about getting answers, cutting through the fog of politics. It's about your questions and our chances to ask.
What is the net impact of the American? Congressman Graves, thank you for joining us.
We're speaking to those in power to find out what does this mean for the people. We're here so you are in the know.
Freedom is not free, and neither is the truth. In order to bring you the facts, our reporters are out there on the front lines getting the true story. Some of them served 10 years of prison in China. We've been censored on social media. Our Hong Kong printing offices were set on fire, and we've been repeatedly attacked by the Chinese Communist Party. But no matter what, we believe that you deserve the truth, and so we'll continue to bring the truth to light. Head on over to getepic.com and try honest journalism that is based in truth and tradition. We'd love to have you on board.
It's just clear as day. The media, whether it's broadcast, cable, or print media, has become extremely biased. And I started looking online for alternative ways to get information. And I saw an ad for a free trial. And I looked at it and I said, Epoch Times. I mean, come on, this is end of days type of stuff. I mean, what are they going to be talking about here? And I said, well, it's a free trial. Let me dig in. Is it giving me both sides? Is it giving me an objective point of view here? I have looked for opportunities to see where they might be biased, and I don't find it. It has given me a level of trust in media that I didn't think I'd ever get back. I love the Epoch Times because it has renewed my faith in the idea that a reliable, responsible, non-biased source of information is available. And I can say that I love it because of that.
Welcome back. Until recently, using the word groomer on Twitter could get you banned. It's happening pretty much all the time. In fact, we have a guest coming up who was dealt that fate. But since Elon Musk took over Twitter, he's been granting amnesty to many of these gone but not forgotten tweeters.
And over this last week, we've seen Dr. Jordan Peterson, the Babylon Bee, Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, Project Veritas, Kanye West or Ye, and most notably, former President Donald Trump, who have all had their accounts restored.
Many conservatives are celebrating, seeing this as a major turning point and a win for free speech. However, many on the left are fleeing Twitter and seeing this turn around as a threat to safety and democracy.
And our next guest, Dr. James Lindsay, was suspended from Twitter several months ago. His crime? Saying okay child sexualization specialist in response to a transgender Harvard instructor. James has been outspoken about the sexualization of children and the push to indoctrinate them with what he calls gender Marxism.
Before his final suspension, James was temporarily suspended in June for calling another user groomer. James, now back on Twitter, joins us. James is the founder of New Discourses and a co-author of Cynical Theories. James, thanks so much for coming on.
Hey, thank you for having me.
So James, I think if you could give a quick introduction to how exactly you were banned and why you felt it was unfair.
Well, I mean, you pretty well summarized it. I had been in trouble for saying okay groomer, which apparently I popularized and had said hundreds of times, but I had deleted all of my okay groomer tweets, seeing that Twitter was taking that quite seriously. And then I called a Harvard instructor from Brooklyn who is trans, a child sexualization specialist, and a new rule was conjured from thin air, and I was removed from Twitter, and it turns out for about 105 days, is what somebody told me.
How significant do you feel this change at Twitter is for the overall narrative in America?
I mean, I think that the opening up of speech on Twitter is going to be profoundly transformational. What the left is doing currently is manipulating language and censoring people who are able to identify or cut through those manipulations of language. They need complete narrative control. And when there's a space for free speech and free dialogue, they lose that complete narrative control. And then their ideas are forced to be considered or compete, which they cannot do because they're false.
James, do you see any concrete examples of this change playing out already?
You know, I think so. I've noticed, for example, when I came back on Twitter that I saw the same trans activist and I made a kind of flippant remark in his direction and I just got blocked. So there's not this kind of cheerful lording of their power any longer. They've realized that they don't have unbalanced power on their side, and the discourse is a little wild right now, frankly, but it's also opening up and truths are being spoken that we're not. And I just saw something a few moments ago, in fact, saying a news report from NBC saying that people are doubling down on inflammatory rhetoric following the shooting in Colorado. And what that means is people are actually not falling for the narrative control and the censorship and the manipulative framing of everything, and they're speaking truth, I guess, to power, as it turns out, much more plainly.
As you mentioned, you were blocked by your friend on Twitter after you came back. It seems like a lot of people on the left, they're threatening to leave Twitter. They're saying they're going to leave, but then they don't really leave. How about for you? How was your ability to reach people impacted after you were kicked off Twitter?
I have a variety of ways to reach people. My YouTube channel, my Instagram, my public appearances in person were all still going very well. And so that my ability to reach people was still strong, but I did lose quite a lot. I had over 300,000 followers on Twitter, which have increased by about 25,000 in the 36 hours or so I've been back on the platform. But I will confess, I wasn't particularly excited, and I'm still not particularly excited to be back on Twitter. I don't know that Twitter is the kind of space that's ideal for our broad public conversation on key issues. It's too reactive. It speaks too quickly and too confidently about big issues. And so I'm not particularly thrilled about the platform at all any longer.
And James, no matter what platform, you've been fighting at full force against the, say, sexualization of children and what you call gender Marxism. So tell us, where are we in this battle, and how could Musk's takeover of Twitter impact it?
So I think that, first of all, the characterization of calling this either gender Marxism or queer Marxism is important, and I encourage people to go to my podcasts and articles on New Discourses to find out why, since I don't have much time here. Where are we now? I would say that it's late 1944 and that we're 3/4 of the way to Berlin. It's a very dark time. It's a very stressful time. It seems very frequently like it's impossible, and yet I think that actually victory is coming around the corner. And so I'm quite encouraged. And of course, creating neutral ground or closer to neutral ground with an open and free dialogue space like Musk is attempting to do with Twitter, and he's smart and learning very quickly about the role he stepped into, is going to be pivotal in changing that, because narrative control and censorship are absolutely crucial to their ability to control what's happening.
Well, I think a key point on that, we saw the mass shooting over the weekend at the LGBT nightclub in Colorado. I'm sure you've been following it. You saw news pundits were quick to blame conservatives and their so-called anti-LGBT rhetoric, criticizing drag queen shows like you've obviously done yourself. They said it's causing violence against the community, since we found out the shooter is allegedly non-binary. What do you make of all this so far?
Well, I mean, I try not to make too much of something like this too quickly. That's the disease in some sense that I think platforms like Twitter encourage. But generally speaking, I think that what we're looking at is a situation where there is a great deal of intense rhetoric, but what we have is a consistent and heavy provocation. The groomer behavior that has been called out is not stopping. In fact, they're doubling down on it. In fact, they've almost stuck their tongues out at the world and said, we're going to do it anyway. And that's very frustrating to some people. I don't think that people should commit violence as a response to this. In fact, it's a terrible idea. It's wrong. It's evil. It's not the right way to go. But the fact is that the provocation is not lessening, and that's keeping the temperature high on the entire dialogue. And the provocateurs know their business. This is a game that they know how to play to provoke violent response and then to try to work it to their advantage. That's literally the Antifa playbook. That is literally the communist mid-level violent strategic playbook that's been run on countries since probably 1917.
Yeah, well, Tiffany and I were saying just before the show, the world is changing so fast. It's just incredible to see and frightening. James Lindsay, we appreciate it. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
And coming up after the break, we have Dr. Scott Atlas joining us to discuss what some are calling the attempt to rewrite pandemic history. The latest attempt? The FDA saying in a response to a lawsuit that it's not telling people not to take ivermectin for COVID-19, said it was only a recommendation. That after the break. Welcome back. Ivermectin. Does that name ring a bell? Ivermectin, horse medicine. Remember last year the FDA told us that we're not horses or cows, so we shouldn't even think about using it to treat COVID-19?
Well, now a group of doctors is suing the FDA over its ivermectin policy, and it seems the FDA is on the defensive.
Indeed. Earlier this year, Boyd & Gray Associates filed a lawsuit on behalf of 3 doctors who allege the FDA illegally interfered with their doctor-patient relationships, resulting in harm. They also claim the FDA broke the law when it put out statements prohibiting using ivermectin to treat COVID-19.
The FDA had already approved ivermectin for other conditions long before we ever heard the word COVID. So the lawyers say once the FDA approves a drug, doctors are allowed to use it off-label, i.e. the FDA does not have the right to dictate how a doctor uses a particular medicine. That means when the FDA put out statements and publications attempting to prohibit ivermectin's use, like saying it was just for cows and horses, it violated its statutory lane and the law.
Well, in response to the lawsuit, lawyers for the FDA claimed that the FDA's guidance for people to stop taking ivermectin for COVID-19 was informal. It was just a recommendation. They weren't mandating that people can't take it. It's interesting. Kind of sounded like they were.
And with us to shine a light on this is Epoch Times contributor and Hoover Institution Senior Fellow, Dr. Scott Atlas. Dr. Atlas, thank you so much for joining us.
Happy to be here.
So, Dr. Atlas, to begin, is the FDA trying to rewrite history here?
Well, I think so. This is unprecedented, frankly, in my 30 years as a doctor, where the use of an FDA-approved drug was somehow forbidden if you used it for, what's called off-label. And in the United States, that's standard of care. Standard of care means what the community practices and the general country practices. Once a drug is FDA-approved, doctors, often use these drugs. And, what is really, frankly, stunning here is that these drugs, and I'm talking about ivermectin, but also hydroxychloroquine, suffered the same fate, were FDA approved in the United States, and they were so safe, billions of doses had been given. They were so safe that many countries don't even require a doctor's prescription. Many countries use some of these drugs over the counter, it's called. So this was really a shocking interference of the ability of a doctor to do his job.
So why the 180?
Well, what we're seeing is a complete Orwellian rewrite of all kinds of things during this pandemic. Many colleagues of mine were always saying the truth will prevail. And once the truth comes out that some of these drugs were either useful or safe and should have been used, and many studies have shown, various clinical trials on these drugs, there's a lot of cover you're behind. We actually didn't just see the FDA forbid it. Because the language of the FDA, pharmacists in many states in the United States refuse to fill prescriptions from doctors. I mean, this is really, like I said, unprecedented. We're also seeing an Orwellian rewrite of what the advice was on a bigger picture. I mean, you listen to people like Deborah Birx say that she was opposed to lockdowns, or Anthony Fauci say he was opposed to closing schools. These are people that, basically are trying to blame those who disagreed with the policies that were implemented for the failure of the policies that were implemented. Truly Orwellian.
You think the FDA is afraid of lawsuits here?
Well, I think this is going to be the natural extension. I don't think that their fear of lawsuits will prevent lawsuits. We're talking about people who were not allowed to take drugs that were safe and FDA approved. Like I say, unprecedented. And, this is, again, one of the bigger failures of the NIH. The NIH could have done definitive clinical trials in the spring of 2020. Instead, they blocked those trials. They made people afraid of those drugs so that even when trials were attempted, patients were not willing to even enter into the trials. I mean, this is really a sort of an unethical abuse of public health here.
And Dr. Atlas, speaking of how unprecedented all of this is, how might this suit affect how doctors treat patients in the future?
You know, we see a lot of legal wrangling going on now that has never been really, seen before. This suit, as well as lawsuits probably going to arise from the new law in California, which somehow, quote unquote, misinformation will be able to be judged and cause a licensure revocation of practicing physicians. So, depending on the outcome of these, there will either be a real chilling of what doctors can say and do for patients, complete interference in a doctor's ability to help a patient, or if the lawsuits go the other way, we will hopefully see a restoration of freedom of medical practice, because what we have now, even the threat of these laws and similar lawsuits has had a chilling effect. There are doctors afraid to tell their patients the truth about medical advice.
That's frightening, Doctor. I think the interesting point on this as well, I don't think it's a stretch to think that the rhetoric around ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine during the pandemic was perhaps to aid the distribution of vaccines and the uptake of vaccines. What you're talking about, misinformation, when you consider these things and the side effects that go along with these vaccines, or apparently go along with them, is frightening.
Well, I will point out something technical, which is that my understanding is that you could not get an emergency use authorization of a vaccine if a drug treatment was readily available. And so it does raise the question about motivation here. We've already seen evidence, and I heard it myself at the task force, which is something that really is unethical in public health, and that is the use of fear to sway opinion by public health leaders. That is frankly unethical and inappropriate, of course. And the second twist on that, if true, would be that drug trials were not done so that EUA, emergency use authorization of vaccines, could be obtained. I'm not claiming that that was a motivation. I'm not sure, but it certainly raises that question.
It's a question worth raising. Dr. Atlas, we appreciate it. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you.
And coming up after the break, we're getting a repeat of last year's snarled holiday shopping, you say. Oh no. What about our trade with the world's second largest economy? We're lucky to be hearing from retired Brigadier General Robert Spalding, an Epoch Times contributor and a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, on what all this means going forward. We'll be right back after a short break. Welcome back. To wrap up this evening, Black Friday is almost upon us. But if you haven't done all your shopping yet, are we in for a repeat of last year's supply chain snarl, leaving shelves empty? And where are all the mini Santas and gifts made anyway? China.
And last year's woes all traced back to COVID lockdowns, and we took a leaf out of China's book. But while they've eased for the most part here, in China, lockdowns are still going strong, and we're feeling the effects. The latest iPhone is seeing delays because of Apple's biggest assembly site in China, Foxconn.
And things there, they're not getting better, they're getting worse. Workers fled the factory, afraid they'd end up trapped under yet another lockdown. They're protesting and clashing with police. But this time, it's over money.
And here to help us make sense of where this is all going and what this means for our holiday shopping is Brigadier General Robert Spalding. He's also a Epoch Times contributor and senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. General, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Great to be back.
So, General, on trade between the two world's biggest economies, we're seeing videos coming out of China of these protests at Apple supplier Foxconn in China. So, how do you see this and other similar cases impacting our trade relations going forward?
Well, what's interesting, if you noticed, the head of AGI brought a team from China to meet with a team from the United States, and his goal, Alan Greenspan's goal, was to basically continue to push capital into China. And so there's this competing effort happening where many of the Chinese proxies, and he's one of them, are trying to help continue to push capital into China, while at the same time we're seeing that these COVID controls within China, which are really about controlling the population, are creating issues with the supply chain. So there's, if you look at the day-to-day movement of the Hong Kong Stock Exchange and the Shanghai and Shenzhen Stock Exchange, you're seeing it go up and you're seeing it go down. In fact, in November, it's gone up quite a bit in anticipation of Xi and Biden's meeting. But at the same time, you have these supply chain issues happening. So, you know, what does that mean? Well, what I think it means is that the Chinese Communist Party is trying to continue to get capital out of the West, continue to remain connected, while at the same time, there's this realization that things are coming apart. So I think what you're going to see is a lot of volatility as a result. You're going to see money pouring in and supply chain breaking. So it's a lot of uncertainty, which doesn't bode well for business.
So, General, let's take one example of this. We see Apple are so reliant on China for their supply chains, but yet we see these protests shutting down factories at Foxconn. Are even these type of China stalwarts going to start rethinking about their dependence on China?
Well, they've already started to rethink their dependence on China. And in fact, the supply chain is already beginning to move. My concern is it's not moving fast enough. As you know, if we get into some kind of issue where you know, there's some kind of confrontation between China and Taiwan, you could see the supply chain be the lever by which the Chinese Communist Party begins to coerce the United States. And so this is my concern. In particular, I'm concerned about pharmaceuticals, but there's a lot of other goods that the United States depends on that is sourced from China, and that's their lever to control the United States. Typically, they've done it through the corporate sector and our financial institutions, but it could be, you know, pulling on the heartstrings of Americans as it impacts their daily health.
General, speaking of this lever, you recently tweeted to remove China's most favored nation status. So how has that helped the Chinese regime get to where they are now, and what will removing this do?
Well, I think that you know, you're going to see the Chinese continue to pressure the United States in ways that you know, certainly Biden was receptive to during their meeting on the sidelines of the G20. And so I think these, Xi Jinping having consolidated power now feels much more emboldened to begin to essentially soothe the concerns of both the United States and her allies to ensure that these lines of communications and connectivity and trade continue to open up and continue to allow both capital and technology to flow into China. That being said, it's going to be, you're going to see with the new Congress coming in, there is going to be pressure put on China or not on China, but really on the administration to begin to completely sever those ties.
Well, General, definitely lots happening and to look forward to, but thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
That's all we have time for this evening. It's great to spend the evening with you and have a very, very happy Thanksgiving. We'll be back again next week. Thank you so much.